The prose poem. Why is a prose poem a poem? Prose poems are sometimes hard to differentiate from brief essays. In fact, sometimes they are published as brief essays, as you'll see when you read Diane Seuss's "I hoisted them, those two drug dealers, I guess that's what they were" for Wednesday. Often the only real difference between a brief lyric essay and a prose poem is that the author has decided it's a poem, or because it's been published in a poetry journal. But not all brief lyric essays can be prose poems. As with all poetry, word choice, rhythm, and abstraction are part of what differentiate a prose poem from plain prose. Elements of a prose poem. Prose poems most often revolve around a single image or idea. Prose poems most often want the reader to feel rather than know something by the end. Prose poems often deploy poetic techniques such as fragmentation, compression, repetition, and rhyme. The advent of the modern prose poem is often attributed to French symbolist writers Aloysius Bertrand and Charles Baudelaire. The prose poem does not include line breaks, as in the more traditional forms. However, it does often make clever use of paragraph breaks, subtitling, sentence structure, and other prose techniques. The haibun, a special form of prose poetry. The haibun is a traditional form of Japanese poetry and one that the more adventurous or poetry-inclined of you might try for this week's assignment. It is comprised of a haiku, a poem of 3 lines with 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, and 5 in the final, and an accompanying passage of brief prose poetry. The haiku and the prose poem may be tightly or loosely connected, but each informs the reading of the other. Elements of poetry and overview. There are certain poetic devices that are frequently deployed by poets. In the following slides, we'll discuss a few of these that lend themselves particularly well to prose poetry. Elements of poetry, allegory. Allegory, a work in which each element symbolizes or represents something else. For example, the nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty, is really a political allegory representing people in government who were falling from power. Elements of poetry, personification. Personification is a figure of speech in which objects and animals have human qualities. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. Emily Dickinson, A Certain Slant of Light. Elements of poetry, hyperbole. Hyperbole is a figure of speech involving gross exaggeration for rhetorical effect, overstatement. The forward violet thus did I chide, sweet thief, whence didst thou steal thy sweet that smells, if not from my lover's breath? Sonnet 99 by William Shakespeare. Elements of poetry, extended metaphor. An extended metaphor results when a metaphor becomes elaborate or complex and is carried through a significant part or the whole of the poem. Death is the broom I take in my hands to sweep the world clean. Langston Hughes, War. Of course, our list is not an exhaustive list. The thing to notice is that poetry very often makes use of figurative language, a figure of speech which has more than the literal meaning. One of the purposes of poetry is to make us see something in a new way, and one of the most effective tools poets have toward this goal is making something seem strange and new to us through figurative language, aligning the thing we think we know, as in the example from Langston Hughes' War, with something unexpected, a broom. This week's assignment, prose poem. This week you'll be writing a brief 150 to 500 words prose poem due Friday to your peer review group. A successful prose poem will capture a feeling or create a new or deeper understanding in the reader, use figurative language, deploy poetic techniques that might but don't have to include rhyming, assonance, alliteration, careful attention to word choice, and simile or metaphor. Feel whole in spite of being brief.